Welcome to the Kevin Bass Show long-form podcast. If you have an idea that you take from this podcast that you want to apply to your own life, you should always talk to your doctor before doing so and never construe anything you hear as medical advice. And with that, enjoy the Kevin Bass Show. Hey, viewers and listeners. In this video, I want to be talking about Ancel Keys, and the reason is very straightforward and simple. There are periods of time, almost cyclical trends, whereby Keys undergoes a new wave of scrutiny and generally propaganda about his ideas, his career, his life, his work. And once upon a time, I looked very deep into this and wrote a series of threads and blog posts about it based on what I read and learned. Now, I once too, like many people, believed many of the theories and, frankly, conspiracy theories about Ancel Keys. Looking deep into the data again, I learned that many of those were not true. And I'm going to go share my findings with you in essentially a myths and facts about Ancel Keys' life video. I'm going to do that just by going through a thread and commenting on it as I go through it and talking to you about it. In this video, I clear up a few myths and provide a few facts about the scientist, the very famous scientist named Ancel Keys. A propaganda campaign has been waged against the reputation of Keys, largely by diet book authors. Ancel Keys provides a convenient enemy. He was extremely prominent and influential in his day, and today he is dead and unable to defend himself. But most importantly, he provides a unitary target, a sole cause, a single demon, a scapegoat, if you will. If carbohydrates are the cause of the obesity pandemic, as these book authors, bloggers, and other prominent health and nutrition influencers online allege, then someone is responsible for making us eat so many carbohydrates. Some one person on whom we can blame everything. This one person is Ancel Keys. Hereby, we have a dietary villain and also a human villain. Responsible for that dietary villain, all sewn up in one nice, pretty, convenient, straightforward, simple story. It makes for great memes, great tweets, and simple, straightforward outrage. And it is therefore very marketable. But how true is it? It turns out almost none of it is true. The horrifying thing is that almost none of the people who write terrible things about Ancel Keys are in fact familiar with his work. All of these people copy, sometimes close to the point of plagiarism, the work of Gary Taubes, who systematically maligned Ancel Keys and created the stories about Ancel Keys that many of us now believe or once believed and propagate amongst each other. Ancel Keys bad, saturated fat good, ooga booga. Indeed, the popular alternative understanding of Ancel Keys' work is a conspiracy theory, and it is based on a gross, wild-eyed misunderstanding of Keys' actual work. Propagating this misunderstanding means propagating a conspiracy theory. Why do I care? Because I personally hate nonsense. This is the kind of nonsense that undermines trust in nutrition science, nutrition scientists, and scientific and public health authorities in general. Needlessly, for no good reason. And believe me, there are some good reasons to distrust authorities at times. And it's important for us to question and sometimes distrust those authorities to keep them accountable. But we don't need false information to do that. We need the facts. We don't need propaganda. We need truth. We don't need information from people who are simply trying to get us to distrust the authorities for no good reason on topics on which it's not important or good to distrust them. We need the science and the actual facts so that we can distrust the authorities on the things that it's important to distrust them about, to call them out, to call them to task when they're doing things wrong, and not add needless noise whenever they're not doing things wrong, because we will always have authorities. We need, in other words, authorities that do a good job, or at least as good a job as the authorities can do. And for that, we need a truthful system of accountability, not one that tells lies. That's what I'm going to be addressing for Ancel Keys. More importantly, however, the nonsense about Ancel Keys tells a false story about nutrition science and will lead to gross misunderstandings about how to eat and live to achieve optimal health. It hurts people who listen to it. Not simply trust in authorities, not simply the information ecosystem, but the actual people who listen to and believe these false stories about Ancel Keys will be harmed as a result of these false stories. What are the false claims made about Keys? We will review the major ones in order. First, it is claimed that Ancel Keys cherry-picked his 7-country study. He had access to the data for 22 countries, but chose to include only 7. It is really hard to explain this in just a few seconds, so we're going to take some time. Here goes. Keys selected 6 countries from publicly available data to show a relationship between saturated fat and heart disease. 2 of his critics plotted an additional 16 countries, showing the relationship was in fact weaker if these new countries were included. Nobody knows exactly why Keys chose only these 6 countries. And he specified only that these countries included the most complete available data. This may have been the reason he chose them. Importantly, however, his critics, who added the additional 16 countries to create a 22-country graph, Yerushalmi and Hillebo, were his critics. They found the same relationship that Keys did, just attenuated, reduced, not as strong. For Keys, it was an incredibly strong log linear relationship. For Yerushalmi and Hillebo, still there was a correlation, but a little bit more loose, which makes sense because saturated fat is not the only cause of heart disease. It's one of many. So, of course, the relationship should be rather loose. The 6-country study clearly, the 6-country graph, the original 6-country graph clearly overstated Keys' case. Furthermore, however, the fact that there was a relationship doesn't mean that the association found by Keys or his critics indicated a real causal relationship. It could have just been correlation and not causation. For this, much more work would be necessary, and this work was later conducted. But it's important to emphasize Keys' work had limitations of which he was aware. We are therefore right to be skeptical of the conclusions of that research in isolation, yet Keys' research was carefully conducted and with integrity. The situation is not at all as the critics allege. They're inventing through their criticism. None of these three facts are mutually exclusive. One can disagree with Keys without believing or inventing lies for why he is evil and or guilty of scientific fraud. He was not any of these things. In any case, the selection of 6 countries out of 22 predates the famous 7-country study. The 7-country study has nothing to do with these earlier papers, except these earlier papers simply created the beginning of a path toward the 7-country study, which was an entirely different study based on entirely different kinds of data than these original 6 and 22 country graphs. 2 different periods of Keys' research career. Surely the 7-country study is a continuation of the 6 and 22 country graphs that we discussed that Keys and Yerushalmi and Hillebo published respectively. It was surely a continuation of these, but it was a completely different study. Continuation of the same research program, but entirely different data altogether. The 7-country study included only 7 countries. Why? Because only investigators from these 7 countries agreed to collaborate. This is because the 7-country study was the first ever international nutrition epidemiology study ever conducted. It was the first of its kind. Already, it was a great achievement. Therefore, to attain cohorts from 7 countries and to conduct a careful study, despite the limitations inherent in nutritional epidemiology, was a huge feat. Simply getting 7 countries was massive. Keys would have liked to have more countries included. Indeed, another point made against Keys is that he purposefully excluded France. This is not true. France was definitely invited, as the paper here documents. And all of these papers will be linked in the description of this video and podcast. Indeed, Keys invited as many investigators to participate as possible. Thus, he, in fact, recruited 16 cohorts from 7 countries, as seen below. 16 separate cohorts, 7 countries. And that was what he succeeded with. Keys has also been accused of misanalyzing the data from Greece during Lent. This, however, is a fabrication, and we can see that in this extract here. You can pause and read this if you need to. Again, the original citation will be included in the description. Finally, it is claimed that Keys ignored the relationship between sugar and heart disease, maligning Yudkin and derailing his career in the process. It's true that Keys was not gentle to Yudkin, his chief scientific opponent at the time, but the data at the time simply did not favor Yudkin's hypothesis. In fairness to me, it does not appear that the data favored either Keyes's or Yudkin's views at the time. I'm only defending Keyes's scientific integrity. I'm not taking a side in the scientific debate. That said, Keys would later promote a much more holistic view of a dietary approach that went beyond saturated fat and blood cholesterol. This is important because people like to present a view of Keys that's obsessively focused on saturated fat and blood cholesterol, and that's simply not true. Keys was, in fact, an earlier proponent of the Mediterranean diet, which, importantly, was a higher fat diet. He wasn't even a low-fat proponent. He was one of the original proponents of the Mediterranean diet, a higher fat diet. Mediterranean diet included the consumption of fish, lean meat, olive oil, nuts, fruits and vegetables, drinking water and some wine, participating in outdoor recreation. He adapted his initial cholesterol hypothesis as data came in, and he moved his approach towards a more general and holistic approach. Here's a figure representing the 5 stages in the evolution of Keyes's diet hypothesis. It started with high cholesterol intake, leading to high blood cholesterol. He falsified that, rejected that view, and took a view about high fat intake. Rejected that view, took a view about high saturated fat intake, rejected that view, and then took a view about high saturated fat, low unsaturated fat intake, rejected that view, and then came to believe in a Mediterranean diet and lifestyle holistically that went beyond simply fat intake to a much larger holistic dietary approach. This is in contrast to the view that Keys was dogmatic and rigid. He was in anything but. And he was a very nuanced, critical, and creative scientist. In fact, one can see this if one just reads his papers. Here's one. It's called Atherosclerosis, a Problem in Newer Public Health by Ancel Keys. You should take a read of it. It's going to be linked in the notes. Here's a summary of some of the criticisms made by popular book authors and bloggers, and I'm going to go and read this, guys, for you, because I want you guys to know that this stuff is not true. The 7-country study was not a random selection of cohorts. It was. France was not included, even though the country was supposedly known for the French paradox. It was invited. These critics are not fair in this case because the 7-country study was never meant to be a randomized trial, but an observational collaborative effort of nutritional researchers around the world, from around the world, brought together by their common interest to test the diet hypothesis. Regarding France, national death rate and diet data in the early 1950s were not very reliable, as pointed out by Yerushalmi and Hillebo, and it was only in the 1980s that the concept of the French paradox was formulated, in 1981 in particular. So it's not like France was excluded because there was a French paradox, and so Keys didn't want to deal with it. It was only in 1980 the French paradox became known. So you can't go back in time and exclude a study based on a phenomenon that you learn about later. I'm just going to go read an excerpt from this paper. Some of Ancel Keys' approaches can be criticized with the hindsight of 50 years of advancement in our knowledge of nutrition and its impact of cardiovascular health. His research in the early years of the 7-country study was very much focused on the dietary factors that directly impacted serum cholesterol, putting the major burden on saturated fatty acids as if cholesterol were a most important link to coronary heart disease. However, as more analyses were carried out over the years of follow-up of the 7-country study, the blood cholesterol focus could be progressively corrected with a more holistic approach to the components of a healthy diet. Another point of criticism relates to the selection of subjects for his studies, who are exclusively men, in contrast to the Framingham study, which included women from the very beginning. This was certainly more convenient for Ancel Keys in designing protocols, as the selected age group, 40 to 59 years of age for the 7-country study, would be more homogeneous in men than in women. In addition, cardiovascular disease, which had reached epidemic proportions in the 1940s and 50s, were much more frequently diagnosed in men. We know today, however, that cardiovascular diseases are often underdiagnosed in women, and that although there has been a steady decline in cardiovascular mortality in the last 4 decades in both men and women, coronary heart disease remains the leading cause of death, not just in men, but also in women in the United States, as well as worldwide. So yes, in hindsight, we can say some of these things, but that's hindsight. Hindsight is, as the cliche goes, 20/20. Here's a list of things that he's accomplished. He characterized adaptation to very high altitude. He developed the K ration to enable the U.S. military to survive with light but dense food. He dissected the physiology of starvation and nutritional rehabilitation to optimize recovery of functions. He uncovered the link between serum cholesterol and heart disease. He coordinated the first major multi-country epidemiological longitudinal study in nutrition and health. He coined the word body mass index, which showed to be the best body weight index to predict body fat, and was the original promoter of the Mediterranean diet for a healthy lifestyle. And I include a more extended discussion in the paper I'm going to link in the description. The idea that Ancel Keys was the leader of some conspiracy against animal products is naturally a conspiracy theory. Such a conspiracy theory is propagated by diet authors to try to control weak-minded followers. Don't fall for it. I hope you found this video helpful. Please share if so. Donate to Patreon. Say nice things about me in the comments. Peace. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please check me out on patreon.com at Kevin and Bass, where you can donate and make this podcast possible. Also check me out on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, where you can find my latest thoughts on the latest controversies and findings within health science. Also check me out at The Kevin Bass Show, both on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. I hope this podcast was useful to you. If it was, please leave me a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. See you guys in the next episode.